here. And as was said, I'm going to talk about the relationships between cannabis cultivation, drug policies, and the environment. And I'm going to focus on California and the experiences in California. One of the things we can talk about at the end is the ways in which the California experience is really different from the ways that cannabis legislation has evolved in other places. This project, I think, like many things, many happy events in life, came from really unintended places for me. I probably, when I finished high school, if we had had a senior superlative category that was least likely to know anything about cannabis cultivation, I would have been a top contender. Lo and behold, here I am, standing in a room, giving a talk about cannabis cultivation. And I ended up looking at this topic because I was working in the north coast of California for my dissertation research when I was a graduate student. And I was looking at how different types of landowners were taking care of their dirt roads, basically, their dirt and gravel roads, to try to understand sediment pollution in the area. And I was looking at ranchers, I was looking at people who own their land for timber production, I was looking at new residential landowners in the region. Almost every single person I talked to said, you can't understand the environment in this area if you don't also pay attention to marijuana. And so I started to pay attention to marijuana, and that was back in 2008. And so some of the insights I'm going to offer come directly from my research, and then I'm also going to draw pretty heavily from work by a geographer at Sarah Lawrence College, Dominic Corva, who's done a lot on the history of understanding the evolution of drug policy and drug production in the region. And also, I'm pretty influenced by the work of an anthropologist and ethnographer who worked in the North Coast for several years, Michael Polson, who's currently a postdoc at UC Berkeley. So some of it's from me and some of it's from them, and none of it's really from me because it all comes from conversations with other people. Everything you do is influenced by others. So my goals in this are to really have you think about the complex linkages between drug policies, and not just the policies, but also how we choose to police those policies and how we change those policies and the environment. I want to start by giving some broad context, thinking about liberalization generally, and also the connections between drugs and the environment, and then I'm going to focus in on the north coast of California. So as you probably know, across much of the globe, there's been a lot of attention to liberalization of cannabis and other drugs as well. Liberalization meaning the legalization or decriminalization of cannabis production for medical uses or for recreational uses. We see this in the headlines all the time. You can go back to 1996. Voters approved the first medical marijuana legalization program in California, Proposition 215. Since then, and especially recently, every year in November, we see headlines similar to this from 2013. New states are approving medical marijuana or recreational laws. This is something that's happening not just in the United States, but in other places as well. In 2013, Uruguay became the first country to legalize commercial cannabis cultivation and commercial cannabis production. Canada has recently moved at the national level to legalize recreational marijuana. And within the United States, the debate continues at the national level. It certainly shifts and changes as our administration changes, but this is from news reporting on a recent Pew Research poll, just talking about the broad increase in support for legalization. As we think about this, much of the debate that happens about whether we think legalization is appropriate or not stems, and for good reasons, stems around public safety and public health concerns, and stems around concerns about the criminal justice system. The work that I've done has really drawn attention to, and works with other people to draw attention to the ways that these processes and drug policies also interact with the environment. So I'm going to stop for a minute and think broadly. How are drugs and drug policies connected to the environment? First, many drugs, not all, are produced through agricultural practices. And like other agricultural practices, that cultivation, that production of them, has environmental impacts. So you can think about water use, the use of agrochemicals. You can think about landscape modification for the practice of agriculture itself. Also, we move around drugs. We traffic them. And the trafficking can have environmental impacts as well. So this is a picture from the north coast of California of just a small marijuana cultivation site. This figure here is a picture from research done by Kendra McSweeney and some of her colleagues looking at the relationship between deforestation in Central America and drug trafficking. And this is a picture of a landing strip in Honduras. And what she argues, and her colleagues have argued, is that there's direct impacts from drug trafficking in terms of deforestation of landing strips, road construction, and then there's also indirect impacts because it changes local economies and there's an incentive to launder money, and that money is often laundered through changes to land uses. And lastly, the eradication of drugs and global drug policies for eradication can have environmental impacts as well. And these can again be direct and indirect. So this is a helicopter that was used in the 80s to spray pesticides for aerial eradication of marijuana plantations in Mexico. That aerial spraying of pesticides hits marijuana crops, cannabis crops, and it also hits other elements of local ecosystems as well. And then the indirect effects of eradication are that when you eradicate in one place, it doesn't make producers stop producing. It just makes them move. And we'll talk about how that happens as well. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to take you to the north coast of California. The north coast of California, the area I'm going to talk about is highlighted in green up here. It is a region that's dominated by dense forests, steep, rugged terrain. It's very remote. It provides habitat for threatened and endangered species. The salmon get all of the attention. There's some other critters that we care about up there as well. And it's really known for its redwood forests, the northern extent of coastal vineyards. It's a little dark in here, but this is a beautiful redwood forest, some ranching activities. It's the site of the Redwood Wars and the historic timber wars from back in the day. And more recently, it's been known as one of the highest producing cannabis regions in the country. California itself is the largest domestic exporter of cannabis, and it's estimated to grow conservatively between 60 and 70% of the cannabis that's consumed in the United States is grown in California. I've seen estimates as high as 79%. It's really hard to track this stuff, and so all of the numbers that come out you can think of as data shadows. They're just little bits and hints of what is actually happening. So the three counties that are highlighted in green are Mendocino, Humboldt, and Trinity County, and they're historically some of the highest producing counties in the state. They've been called and termed the Emerald Triangle to indicate their strong role in this green crop. We lack data on how much is actually produced there, but we know that this is a really important economic activity in the region. Consultants have estimated, and various reports have estimated, that it's between 20 to 30% of the local economies up there. And that is certainly wrong, but we don't know exactly how wrong. And in many ways, this area is really ideal for cannabis production. It's remote, it's forested, so it's hard to get to, it's sparsely populated, there aren't very many people looking over your shoulder. But the growth of cannabis in the region isn't just about that remote location. It's not just about the climate, it's not about the biophysical factors. The history of cannabis in the region traces back to local, state, domestic, and global drug policies, and cultural characteristics as well. And so cannabis production in the region traces back to the late 1960s. At that time, there were the culture wars, there was an increase of drug use, an increase of cannabis use, and there was a movement of people from urban areas to rural areas as part of a movement called the Back to the Land movement. And many people moved from San Francisco up to Humboldt and Mendocino counties especially. They settled on this land, they homesteaded, and as part of their homesteading gardens, they also grew cannabis. And they refined cannabis, and they made some nice strains of cannabis. Since then, cannabis production in the region has changed dramatically. And these slides, these figures might be pretty hard to see for you guys. But what this shows is an area in Trinity County, which is a little inland, called Post Mountain. The aerial photos, the first one is from 2005, and it shows a bunch of roads in 2005. In 2012, all of these little cutouts that have popped up are almost certainly places where people are growing cannabis. Almost certainly. They're places where people are doing outdoor production and or greenhouse production. And I, just out of curiosity, on Tuesday, as I was looking through these slides, I pulled up the Google imagery for 2017, and I felt a range of emotions when I compared from 2012 to 2017. There's been this tremendous growth in the region, and I want to step through kind of slowly some of that history. I don't know, maybe it's not slowly, maybe it's quickly. Depends on your perspective, right? Depends on what you study. All right, so I'm going to start in the 60s. As I mentioned, in the late 60s and really through the mid-1970s, there was this movement from back to the landers into the north coast of California. They came, in many cases, when we think about who's producing drugs, we think about these campesinos, we think about little rural people from other places that might be poor and that they're involved in this industry for lots of different reasons, or we think of very rich people. These people are white, largely. They're largely middle class, and they're largely well educated, and they made a choice to move to this area. And it was this purposeful settling in this new area to change their life and to live a different way. When they did start to make money off of their crop instead of just for home consumption, a lot of it was put back into the community to support schools and to support various other needs that the communities had. And so at this time, when we think broader, outside of this region, most of the cannabis that was consumed in the United States was actually grown elsewhere. So it was either produced in Mexico or Colombia. There was also inputs from Jamaica, Thailand, and just a little bit for a short time from Belize. This started to shift in the early 70s. In the early 70s, there was a shift towards domestic production, and there was also a dramatic increase and rise in production in this area. Some people call this the first green rush. Some people say this is the green rush that started and never ended. And the growth of cannabis in this area as an export commodity happened as a side effect of US drug policies and global policies elsewhere. So at that time, the United States was putting pressure on Mexico to eradicate cannabis. In the early 70s, they did manual eradication of cannabis. And then in the mid-70s, Mexico started doing aerial spraying of pesticides. They also launched, at that time, a media campaign to inform people about this pesticide use. And because of that, there was attention that people started to pay to having their cannabis produced in an area that they believed was not sprayed with this pesticide. And so that increased the demand for domestic cannabis and increased demand for cannabis that you could tell was not grown in Mexico. So it also reduced the supply coming from Mexico and generally increased the price. So people knew that this was an area that people were growing. And at that time, you saw cultivation spread from just the back to the landers to also a bunch of new people moving in. And those new people were moving in specifically, so the story goes, to make money. At that time, you also started to see these old families that had been there for generations on ranches and timber producing very slowly start to become involved in production as well as the natural resource economy continued to crash. In the early 80s, we started to get your national war on drugs. And there was a general moral panic across the United States about drugs, and efforts ramped up to eradicate drugs domestically as well. And so the campaign against marijuana planting was a multi-agency effort that was established in 1983 to eradicate outdoor cannabis production. Early on, it focused specifically on these 3 counties in the north coast of California. From August to October, it became very common to hear very low-flying helicopters doing aerial surveillance, and then there would be very paramilitary-like raids and eradication of large cultivation sites. And so this police pressure shifted cultivation again. At that time, a lot of people moved indoors. They moved indoors, though not on the grid. They moved indoors off of the grid. And growing off of the grid involved using diesel generators. And those diesel generators are known for having spills in sensitive watersheds or are concerns for that. People often also shifted their outdoor production. They shifted their outdoor production from these beautiful sunlit places to producing under the trees. They shifted from having all of their plants together to having dispersed plants in many locations. And the reason they did that was because if you're flying a helicopter and you spot a whole bunch of cannabis plants, you don't need a warrant to go down and search that property. And so if you can make your plantation invisible, from the sky at least, then you're less subject to those surveillance and eradication activities. There was also a shift at that time from production that was occurring mostly on private lands to what has become known as trespass grows. Production on either other people's lands, production on public lands, national parks, state parks, et cetera, BLM land, and production on tribal lands. And this happened because it reduced people's liability. So during the camp era, when there was eradication efforts, oftentimes that property was seized as well. But if you're growing on someone else's property, then your own land can't be seized as part of that drug bust. And so we see, again, this moment where the choices that are being made about drug policies and how we're policing drugs are impacting what's grown. And then you can take another step and think about how that impacts how it's grown and the environmental impacts. Things shifted again, starting in 1996 and moving onwards with the liberalization. In 1996, California voters passed Proposition 215, which legalized medical marijuana across the state. There were lots of ambiguities about what this actually meant. And so in 2003, yep, the state legislative body passed Senate Bill 420, or SB 420, the Medical Marijuana Program Act, and that was designed to codify how medical marijuana would be regulated across the state. And what it basically did was said, we have no statewide regulation, everything goes down to the county level. Counties can make their own rules about how much people can grow for medical purposes and how those worked. At the start, Humboldt and Mendocino had some of the most permissive laws that changed up and down, fluctuated through the years. But Senate Bill 420 also, through court cases that came out after it, gave a lot of protections to people who were growing cannabis and growing cannabis for medical uses. And it made it so that it became very hard to prosecute people for growing cannabis. And so at that time, there became a real blur between production for medical marijuana and production for the black market, because it was very easy to simultaneously grow for both. And the state laws and liberalization provided protection, even when growing for the black market. Along the same time, this also shifted eradication efforts as well. Camps started to move their eradication efforts from just this area to also focusing on other parts of California, and then slowly sort of wound down until it was abolished and eradicated itself, I suppose, in 2012. And there were some further cultural changes in acceptance of production during that time as well. This was associated with what people think of as the second green rush, and this further in-migration of people. And when you saw how the land use changed in that one particular region of Trinity County, that's associated with all of these changes in policies, changes in enforcement of drug laws, and basically making cannabis licit in the area. Most recently, there's been some dramatic changes in the last 2 years and going forward, and I'll talk about these very briefly at the end. And that's going to continue to change how cannabis is produced. In this second green rush, you saw people move from trespass grows back onto private land. You saw people move from the shadows out into the open. People were no longer worried about being seen from above and it remains a question about what that will be like going forward. So cannabis is produced in this region in three primary ways. You have large and small-scale indoor hydroponic production, you have outdoor greenhouse production, and you have fully exposed outdoor production. All of these can take place at various scales. You can have very small-scale cultivation to large operations that have thousands and tens of thousands of plants. Production occurs on private properties and then also on trespass grows, so growing on other people's lands. Despite this diversity of how cannabis is produced and how it's grown, we often see all of these different groups lumped together when we talk about how it's impacting the environment or we think about how production is going to continue. And so one of the things that I try to work on is thinking about being attentive to who we're talking about when we're talking about environmental impacts, and being attentive to who we're talking about when we're trying to govern those environmental impacts. So I'm going to focus on outdoor production for the rest of this talk. It's hard to study outdoor production. It's even harder to study indoor production. So I'm going to be in this middle ground of hard. It's what we know the most about when we understand the environmental effects. So we know when we think about cannabis in the environment, we know that cannabis impacts the environment. There was a recent assessment that tried to map all of these places that we can see from above and to understand what sort of the cumulative impact of those cultivation sites would be across the landscape. And what they found was that even though the actual footprint, the total amount of land that's used for cannabis cultivation across this study was focused in Humboldt County, is small, the localized impacts can be large, and they matter because often cultivation is happening on steep slopes, so unstable slopes where sedimentation is a concern, or it's happening in habitat that's important for sensitive species. So we know that cannabis is a relatively high water use plant, and that the growing season coincides with California's dry season. So in California, Mediterranean climate, rains in the winters, pretty dry in the summer. Cannabis plants are thirsty in the summer. And that means that people need to get water to water them, to irrigate them in the summer. That is often happening through diversion of surface waters or headwater streams. In many cases, these are unpermitted diversions and illegal diversions. And they're thought to be threatening the flows, particularly in streams that have low flows anyway, and in these times where species are sensitive. And some studies that have used assessments based on aerial imagery to try to understand, well, how much are people actually using, have mapped grow sites, and then they've estimated, based on best ideas about how much water people are using, how much water they might be using in a whole watershed. And they found that water use can be responsible for fully dewatering a stream in the summer if everybody is actually pulling from surface water and headwater streams. This is important because it challenges aquatic and riparian habitat, and in particular habitat for salmon. People are also concerned about agrochemical use. It's a nutrient-intensive crop as well. We don't have a very good sense of how much fertilizer people are using in different areas. We don't have a very good sense of how much is leaching out in many places. From data that people have collected after drug enforcement activities, we do know that in some places on trespass grows, fertilizer use is very heavy. We have no idea how that maps other types of production. We know that pesticide use can be quite aggressive, and that the pesticides used are sometimes substances that are banned in the United States. But the pesticides are used to deter browse by other animals. They're used to keep rodents away. There's a lot of rodenticides that are used. They're used also not just on the plants themselves, but to deter browse and damage to irrigation lines. And we have, from post-enforcement activities on trespass grows, there's lots of anecdotal evidence of finding pesticides and banned substances on these sites. And then there's also evidence of, that comes from conversations with people who are active in the grow community of illegal pesticide use on private lands as well, but we don't know the extent of these practices. But we do know, we have evidence that pesticides from marijuana production is entering the food chain and is impacting animals that are sensitive species as well. We also know that cannabis cultivation has led to landscape modification. Areas are cleared, as you saw. Areas are cleared of trees for cannabis production. Hillsides are flattened and graded or terraced and significantly altered. And broadly, vegetation is removed. In some places, you can have trail building activities that extend beyond the site itself, or road building activities that extend beyond the site itself. And these concerns come from what we see from satellite imagery, private land cultivation, and then also come from post-enforcement studies of sites that have been subject to drug enforcement activities. These are concerns because they fragment the landscape, they can cause hill slope instability, they can lead to erosion and sedimentation into streams, which is a major threat for local aquatic species as well. And then there's some other concerns that have been documented on public lands. There's a lot of issues with trash and human waste production. There are issues with poaching of various species, and then there are some concerns about the spread of non-native species as people go through very remote areas. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some challenges in understanding these. So when we try to understand anything, we face scientific challenges of studying them, but those are magnified when you're trying to understand something that people try to keep invisible on the landscape. And so we know that these practices exist, we know that they matter to local ecosystems, but we don't know the extent of them, and there's a lot we can't say about them. And what we don't know and what we don't see is linked to its legal status. It's linked to what's legal, what's permitted, what's not permitted, what's policed, what's enforced, and then how people grow and produce because of that. Research on these topics is broadly challenged by funding and lack of legislative direction. When I started working in this area in 2008, I talked with staff at natural resource agencies and I said, you know, a lot of landowners are talking about marijuana, what do you think? And they said, you know, this is a huge, huge issue. And we know that this matters, or we think it's a huge issue, but we don't know how much it matters, and we don't know and we can't study it because there's no legislative mandate, and we're mandated to study what the state tells us to study, and there's no funding to study it. That's changed since 2008, but that's been a major hurdle. There are also staffing challenges. When I've talked to people working on this, they say it's really hard to get research assistants to work on this. It's hard because there are safety concerns associated with going out into remote areas. And so actually going to sites is something that you don't want to do unless you know what you're doing. And then it's also people are concerned about issues of retaliation. There's a researcher who's done a lot of research on pesticide use, and he receives threats all the time. And his own dog was poisoned, which is like devastatingly sad. But it leads to other people being concerned about their own safety in participation. And then it's also hard to find people who want to participate and do this research but don't have their own political agenda, which is another concern. It's also hard to work on this because there's a lack of access to sites. It's hard to know where you can do research, and there's a lot of uncertainty about what people are doing and where they're doing it. It's hard to study things if you don't know what you're studying. There are two primary ways that people learn about the environmental impacts. People do field research. Most of the field research that they do comes from assessment of sites that are undergoing drug enforcement activities. And so what does this mean? This means that drug enforcement agents are gatekeepers for what we know about the environmental impacts. Researchers at state agencies have very productively collaborated with drug enforcement agencies to set up relationships where they go in at the time of enforcement activities and they take water quality samples, they look at the situation, they try to understand what's been used and why. But it's hard to learn what you really need to learn in those circumstances because you are subject to what the drug enforcement priorities are, which don't always align to what you want to know about the environment. So if you're concerned with fertilizer use and you're concerned with pesticide use and how that's going to infiltrate into a stream and environment, you may have trouble getting in there on the first day that it rains, which is really when you want to test the water. So you can't access the sites when you need to, and you also have an extra layer of gatekeeping that's happening there. The second way is that people use these aerial assessments. So they use satellite imagery to map where production is happening, and then they use the best knowledge about how people are probably managing to make sort of broader assessments of what's going on in the environment. And this is really the best that people can do when trying to understand cultivation on private land. And it can be useful for getting a sense of broad issues and what might be happening in a cumulative impact perspective. But it's really problematic when you try to use it to understand historic practices and when you think about what's going to happen in the future. And it's problematic when you try to understand trends because people used to cultivate under the trees. And so when we talk about how much cultivation has increased by looking at trends and what you can see from a satellite, that's a little bit misleading. Research is also challenged because one of the tools that we don't have up there is that we don't do agricultural field station research on cannabis cultivation. And we don't do that because cannabis, despite being legal in many states, is still a Schedule I drug at the federal level, which means that it's very heavily controlled by the federal government and that you can't get permission to grow it without a very tremendous, difficult permitting process that requires actually doing research on site. So we don't do a lot of research to try to understand how it interacts with different pesticides. We don't do any research really to understand different growing conditions and how they play out on the ground. The illegality of cannabis thus influences and also the legality and licitness, who does research. It influences how and where that research is done, and it influences what data is collected. All of that together really makes it hard for us to identify causal linkages between cannabis cultivation and ecosystem characteristics. It makes it really hard to accurately assess the cumulative impacts of production, or even to create error bars around the assessments that we do produce. We don't have a good sense of the uncertainty of what we know. It makes it really hard to tease out how different types of cannabis cultivation practices are influencing the environment, which means that we lump everyone together in one big group. And it also makes it really hard to assess the relative impacts of cannabis versus other land uses. And this is really important in the North Coast region because this is actually a key issue of debate that's very divisive in communities, is whether the environmental impacts that people are concerned about are actually from cannabis production or if they're legacy issues associated with the long legacy of timber producing in the region. There's a lot of finger pointing in this region, and it impacts what people do from a voluntary perspective and how they interact with regulatory agencies. So though we have imperfect knowledge, there's a lot of awareness that's growing. And so these are just a range of recent headlines from all sorts of different news sources, Vice, the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, this is from the Atlantic, where people have been talking about these environmental impacts. People have been talking in the media about these environmental impacts, and then there's also been efforts by state agencies, local government, nonprofit organizations to do something about them. So historically, from 2008 to 2015, there were efforts to deal with the environmental impacts through environmental regulations. Existing environmental regulations also apply to, if they apply across all land uses, that would include illegal land uses. There have been a lot of education efforts, both formally and then also informally. This is a pamphlet that was made about best management practices for how to take care of your land when you're involved in cannabis cultivation. There have been community forums, radio shows. There's efforts to get people these large storage tanks so that they can store water in the winter and use that for irrigation in the summer. This here is the logo from an eco-label. It's called the Clean Green Certification Program, and it's an eco-label that is meant to certify. It's supposed to be, and they say something like, it's the closest to organic certification that you can get. And why can't you certify as organic? because it's a Schedule I drug. And so we have no research about it, and also we can't certify it. So all of these face challenges also associated with the legal status. So there's tremendous concerns about being involved in anything where there might be a record of your involvement. So Mendocino County, many years back, said, you know what, actually, we want to have some serious environmental regulations associated with our own medical marijuana program. And they made a county-wide registration program where people who were growing for medical purposes had to tag their plants, and they had to comply with all of the local county-wide environmental regulations, which sounds like a really great thing, until the federal government said, you need to give us your registry data. And they demanded that the county turn over the data on everybody that had registered to be a good producer. And so people are afraid of becoming registered. Many people, not everyone. People are afraid of becoming registered because that makes them susceptible to enforcement of federal drug regulations. And this happens for both regulatory efforts, and then it also matters for non-regulatory efforts where you're somehow on the books. Other issues associated with that are that there's certain types of research that can't be done because of federal illegality. Any nonprofit agency that receives federal funding has to think very carefully about how they engage with non-regulatory education or financial incentive activities associated with cannabis production. So the University of California Cooperative Extension Master Gardeners Program exists to provide people advice about all things gardening. And they have an explicit policy. They have an internal memo about, and actually I think it's a public memo, about not providing advice on cannabis cultivation. And they won't do that because they're USDA funded. And so providing advice would make them at risk of losing some of that funding they feel. There are safety concerns associated with just monitoring efforts and going onto people's lands for enforcement activities. There are limited resources. That's also changing. And then cannabis in this region is a very divisive issue. There are people who think it should be accepted. There are people who don't like it. There are people who want to see it continue, people who want to see it leave. And nonprofit organizations have talked with me about the ways in which they are reluctant, some of them, not all of them, reluctant to engage in this issue when there is so much uncertainty about what is causing environmental impacts in the region, and when they're afraid to be perceived as either pro or anti-cannabis cultivation. And so all of these things limit what different organizations and what different regulatory tools, how they work, and why they work in particular areas. I want to sort of close this by talking about how the situation is changing now. A lot of the sort of ways that we've understood cannabis production in the region, the attention that we've paid to cannabis production has happened from about 2010 onward. And all of that has happened in this era of liberalization. It's happened at this time when there's been no statewide regulatory structure governing cannabis production, and that is changing. In 2015, the state legislature passed the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act, which consisted of 3 different bills that were jointly enacted to create a comprehensive statewide regulatory system for medical marijuana at the time. And one of those bills, there was a lot of lobbying to get the legislature to directly address the environmental impacts of cannabis production. And so one of those bills was specifically focused on the environment. And it created a new mandate for the California Department of Food and Agriculture to actually think about what growers, producers, cultivators need to do in order to be producing in a way that is safe for the environment. It also created and tasked the Department of Pesticide Regulation to develop standards for the application of pesticides within California for medical marijuana. It gave a legislative mandate to the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the State Water Resource Board to protect water quality issues that are directly associated with marijuana production. This all together allocated in 2016-17 about $18 million towards environmental protection associated with cannabis cultivation. And this, in effect, created this new program that's delineating what would become legal cannabis from illegal cannabis. This was followed in 2016. California voters passed Proposition 62, which was the Adult Use of Marijuana Act, and that legalized cultivation, distribution, and use by adults aged 21 and older. And at that time, this was layered on top of the state bills. And since then, the state has been working to, they made some new legislation that marries them and sort of streamlines the processes. They've been creating a statewide regulatory system for both medical marijuana and recreational marijuana or adult use marijuana. And in that licensing system is attention to environmental issues. Now people who are cultivating are no longer going to be able to sit comfortably in this gray area. They're no longer going to have the protections afforded by Proposition 215, but also the freedom to participate in the black market. Or that's a likely, it depends on how things are enforced. And so people are coming to a point where they have to make a choice. And they're going to have to choose whether they participate in the legal market in California or whether they leave cultivation totally or whether they participate solely in the black market. And that reorganization of production, that reorganization of space is going to have implications for how cultivation actually impacts the environment. It's also going to have implications for what we know about cultivation and what we can do about it. So there's lots of questions, and I'm going to end with all of these questions rather than answers, because this is an evolving circumstance and an evolving situation. So thanks so much. There's lots of people to thank always, but most especially people who I've interviewed, because that's time that they gave me that I am forever indebted and grateful for. And thank you all.
I'll start with a couple of questions. So my first shorter question is, have you seen any changes in the demographics of the population who is growing the marijuana now in California? And the second question is, can you speak a little bit about how this compares to what might happen in the future in Massachusetts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the North Coast region, the demographics have shifted in ways that are difficult to track, for me anyway. You can think broadly about shifts in producers from just these back to the landers to this new population that involves these old ranching families that have been on the land for 5, 6 generations, to also these new, and they often get stereotyped as moving from the East Coast or from Oregon. So these new influx of people from the East Coast and from Oregon coming in to basically rape the land and make money is how the narrative goes. There's also some production there that also takes place through organized crime. That organized crime, when it gets talked about, is often linked to Mexican cartels and a very racialized narrative about drugs as well. But there's a real dearth of evidence that links those in a way that is credibly links those. There certainly is organized crime activity, but the degree to which it is solely Mexican or more diverse is unknown. I went to a meeting this summer. This summer, the state held public meetings about these new regulations. They're doing an environmental impact assessment of how the new regulations will impact the environment. That's part of the NEPA and CEQA process, which are the National Environmental Protection Act and the California Environmental Quality Act. But they require an assessment of any new regulations and the impact that they'll have on the environment, and they also require a process of public meetings. And so I went out to California to view some of these public meetings. Usually when you go out to study public meetings, you know, you sit in this room and there's this public comment period, and you take rapid notes on all of these public comments, this was the most fascinating public meeting I have ever gone to, because I went to 2 of them, and they were both the same. You walk in, you sit there, you wait for a long time, and then there's a presentation by the state agency about the new laws. And then they say, all right, it's time for public comments. There's a little table over there with a court stenographer, and if you have a public comment, you can go and whisper your comment to them, and they will write it down and record it. It will become part of the public record, but there was no public airing of the comments, which to me is suggestive of the very sensitive nature of it. This all becomes public comment, but the desire to sort of keep control of the dialogue and the discourse that's happening in this public setting. But at that meeting, I would say that every stereotype you could imagine for a cannabis producer, there was there. Like literally every person that you might draw in a comic book was there, and then lots and lots of other people as well were there at these at these meetings. It was a very low-key party. And then the second question about Massachusetts is the evolution of how this has played out in California is really different than how it's played out in other states. When California legalized medical marijuana, it did so in a way that did not create a statewide regulatory structure. That's not the same anywhere else. In other states where medical marijuana or recreational marijuana has been legalized, it comes along with a set of rules statewide that govern who gets to produce, why they get to produce, and how they get to produce. In some states, those laws come alongside with explicit mention of environmental impacts and attention to them, and in most states they don't. Maybe it's about half and half. And so the Wild West that you have seen evolve, and this blurry medical marijuana market and black market in California, that's not going to evolve here. Most of the states now are moving towards, if they aren't already doing it, they're moving towards tracking from plant to dispensary. And so they have systems where they're tracking each plant that's grown for legal sale. Colorado does this. California's new regulations are doing it. I believe the Northwest is doing it too. Washington's doing it. And that system really makes a very clear line between the black market and the legal market. And that is a very big influence on how production unfolds and why it unfolds in different places. In Massachusetts also, we don't have the same history of outdoor production. A lot of the production that is going to happen here is going to happen indoors as well, which has a different set of environmental issues associated with them. Largely energy use and waste, dealing with your waste. Yeah.
So when you mentioned that there's a clean grower label, it kind of got me thinking about how you can have fair trade coffee, you can buy shade grown coffee. Do you think the conversation and the public awareness of the environmental destruction that cannabis causes is going to incite growers to want to label their product as environmentally friendly? And if it's not currently happening, do you think it's down the road?
Yeah, so I think there is a little bit of movement towards that way. I would say that some of the focus on it is not just about the environment, but more public health impacts and wanting to know what pesticides are on the product that you are ingesting into your body in one way or another, especially if it's being used for medical purposes. And so I think there is a possibility for certification programs, but certification programs are expensive for people to be involved with. And so there needs to be a price signal associated with them. With California's new laws, there is some tracking of pesticide use, and there is some testing, and other states do this too for pesticide residues, which will help people have more confidence about where their cannabis is coming from and what might be on it. And so that reduces the incentive for people to spend additional money beyond that for something as well. There's been some work by someone out of Oregon, her last name's Bennett, and I can't remember her first name, that has looked specifically about consumer demand for eco-labeled and certified cannabis with a focus on Oregon. And I can point you to that after.
Hi, thank you for speaking. It was really informative. And I was just wondering if there's any data, just because California is a large agricultural producer, to compare the environmental consequences of cannabis cultivation in scale or magnitude to the environmental consequences of producing things like almonds or other produce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question, and no. People look at it in different ways. So people look and say, you know, cannabis production is very water intensive because the per plant water use is very high. There's a researcher at UC Berkeley, Van Butzik, who has done a lot of the work that's mapping sites, and he's an ecological economist. And from his economic perspective, anytime anybody says it's a water-intensive crop, and he said this to me, criticizing me, he says, you know what, I disagree. When I look at this, I think this is a really water-efficient crop. If you think about the amount of water use for the dollar that's received, instead of thinking about the water use for the plant. And so when you think about the environmental impacts, it depends on whether you're thinking about the footprint or the economic footprint, or sort of if you're looking at the degree to which it's impacting local ecosystems and actually shifting them across thresholds or not. And so that it's a hard one to define as a problem, and I haven't seen that done.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm struck by initial research. I've never seen that on a slide before. And I was wondering if you could talk to us about where your current research, how are you sustaining this research? You explored the limitations. You've managed to keep it going. What would you like to do next? And who's funding it now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of the work in the middle. So the initial research was part of my doctoral research, and I was funded as a graduate student through the National Science Foundation Graduate Fellowship Program. And then I also had a dissertation research grant, which was supplemental money specifically for research. And that got me up into the North Coast, and that got me talking to people about non-point source pollution, and that got me thinking and talking to people about cannabis cultivation as well. I then finished my graduate studies, and I moved out to Boston University to start a faculty position, and I stopped being on the NSF payroll until I had a different project that was focused on Massachusetts. And initially, the way that I kept involved in this project was through phone interviews. And phone interviews are delightfully inexpensive, especially if you happen to be at an institution that pays your phone bill. Not all institutions pay your phone bill. And so I was able to do a lot of the work in the middle on the cheap. I also travel out there. I still have friends because I went to graduate school. I have a very good friend and neighbor whose family is still in Humboldt County and who has a lot of contacts in the industry as well. And so there are connections back and forth across the coast as well. More recently, as the regulatory system has been changing, I have gone out there a little bit, and that I fund through research funds at BU. I get a little money I can spend on anything I want every year, and so that's how I spend it, or one way I spend it. Looking forward, I'm working with a graduate student, or actually she's a postdoc now at UC Berkeley, to put in an application to the National Science Foundation to do some work that is looking at what factors are shaping people's decisions about entering into the legal market or not. And so the questions that I have moving forward are, now that we see this formalization of these regulations, now that we see likely greater enforcement of these regulations and the separation of the medical market and the black market, how are people making choices and why? And how is that reorganizing production? And to do that well, I need some extra help. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.